Welcome to Gartner's ThinkCast. I'm Rob O'Donoghue, a Senior Director Analyst in Gartner's CIO Research Group, focusing on leadership, culture, talent, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm back today with the final part of a special three-part series on one of the most pressing issues of our time, diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you missed part one, featuring my conversation with Chris Steadley, the Global Head of DEI here at Gartner, let me suggest you click back and give it a listen. The same goes for part two, featuring Emily Stroder, and check out our complimentary Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Resource Centre, which is chock full of insight and linked in the show notes. As for today, we're focusing on inclusion, specifically inclusive leadership. And we're joined by Christie Struckman, a VP Analyst on Gartner's CIO research team. Christie's work focuses on helping C-level executives align the organizational building blocks needed to succeed in the modern era. And she spent years actively researching and advising clients on DEI. Christie, welcome.
It's wonderful to be here with you, Rob.
I'm really looking forward to hear from you on everything inclusion related.
Let's get included.
Great. So look, I know from having the pleasure of working with you and researching with you that definitions are very important. So perhaps maybe we should start here with a definition for inclusion. Can you define it and maybe how it fits into the DEI conversation?
Absolutely. So inclusion is that achievement of your work environment in which all individuals, and the operative word is all, are being treated fairly and respectfully, and they have equal access to opportunities and resources, and therefore can contribute fully to the organization or the team's success. So the important point is that inclusion is an outcome of the things that we do to help everybody to feel included.
Very clear, very detailed. What is so important about inclusion?
Because when somebody feels included, there's a very tangible impact, but our organizations have a very tangible impact as well. What we know is that employees that feel included, 35% of their emotional investment in their work and 20% of their desire to stay in an organization can be tied to that feeling of inclusion. We also know that teams that are diverse in gender, for example, and highly inclusive, they perform 40% better than teams that are only diverse. So if you really want to pump up the contributions of your team, you've got to have diverse employees, but then you also have to make them feel included. And as a matter of fact, only having a diverse team, but not having the people on that team feeling included really degrades the performance of that team. So inclusive teams will work, based on our research, 12% harder, and they'll be 50% more collaborative. So I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers out there, but the impact is that the teams that we work in perform better, feel more collaborative, can be more innovative. Another term that we talk a lot about in this inclusion space is creating psychological safety. Psychological safety is that shared belief that members of a team feel comfortable taking interpersonal risks. So it's not just that I feel that people know me and respect me, but I feel like the team will have my back, because team members that will feel more comfortable taking risks will encourage teamwork, encourages authenticity, fosters better learning and innovation because I'm willing to try new things, and improves those outcomes that we are also worried about right now in terms of intent to stay.
Very true. And I guess if somebody's listening, have they ever thought about a time in a team when they either had psychological safety or the opposite, felt that kind of psychological danger that it didn't exist, and how difficult it could make work in general, just being able to show up every day. So I think it's hugely important. Interesting when you were talking about all the percentages there, right? It does seem like, and from the evidence we've seen in our own research, that while inclusion is so important and leads to so many benefits that you talked about, it is in many ways heavily and highly overlooked. Would you see that's the case? And where is the disconnect?
Organizationally, I think there's been great focus on doing things like bringing in unconscious bias training, for example, or creating employee resource groups so that people feel that they can have a tribe to spend some parts of their day with. So I feel like we are doing quite a bit to set up a framework for employees to feel included. But the disconnect is because inclusion is felt in the day-to-day activities. So what do I mean by that? You can't dedicate Monday to be your inclusion day. It actually has to be infused in just about everything that we do as leaders, what our teams do with each other, and even what we hear happening with the near-term partners that we work with. And I just feel like the disconnect is that while we have these things in place, how you and I interact, Rob, in a team meeting is where the inclusion is felt. And it's when we take those things that we've learned and that we now understand are important and we understand what might make somebody feel marginalized or not, and we watch for it and we pay attention to it within ourselves. And then we also hold each other accountable. Because here's what happened. I could work in a team where we've had unconscious bias training and I might belong to a couple of ERGs and I might have an organization that does a lot for different diverse groups. But if we're in a team meeting and people don't demonstrate that they value me and the differences that I bring in the flow of the work, there's these marginalizing behaviors that we can do to each other, that's when I don't feel included, is when those things happen. So that disconnect is that, yes, we have to put all of those structures in place. We have to have the processes and the practices that give us the framework to be inclusive, but it's the translation into the day-to-day behaviors where it's most felt.
Of course, you want to become a more inclusive leader, but it's easier said than done. To help you along the way, download our research on how to develop sustainable, inclusive leadership for future success. Check it out at the link in the show notes. We do see a lot of companies institute unconscious bias training, and of course, that's the right thing to do. It is a great starting point in many ways, but it tends to just maybe stop there. Why is the book stopping there?
We really sort of see the struggles for three reasons. So the first one is that unconscious bias training is all about helping us to understand better our attitudes. It's pretty easy to get a little defensive about that. So while we have to do that, we do realize and we do need to acknowledge that it can be really hard to hear that you, Christie, you have an attitude that you need to change. Just think about if you've come in and you go into a team meeting and somebody looks at you and they say, "Hey, Rob, you look really frustrated." Who likes to be told that? Even in the non-DE&I space, you have to work around that. So that doesn't help. It's just hard when you're in the training to not feel a little bit of who I am is being attacked. And they actually have a very specific language for it. It's called reactance, which is where you sort of feel that resistance. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is that the whole point of unconscious bias training is to apply what you learn. And so that was my comment earlier. It's work, it's effort, and it's constant work and effort. And it's to be applied anytime you're working with anybody else, which for most of us means all day trying to apply it. So the effort to retrain the way that we think about things, the language that we use, it just takes a lot of effort. And then we find that it diminishes over time. So your sensitivity, your paying attention, all of that, just maybe it's very salient and you can remember to apply it. But then as the weeks progress, going into months, and work gets busy and you're feeling up against deadlines, and maybe you've got some frustrating issues that you're trying to resolve, it's hard to just remember and bring that back. So unconscious bias training, we have to do it because we need to get the acumen out of what does it take to be inclusive. But that's why it seems to not have maybe as much impact as we were hoping it to have.
It's a great starting point, but to really embed the learnings from it, to put in that behaviors into place to make them become habits, what can leaders do next?
Okay, so I mentioned earlier about those marginalizing behaviors, and we cover typically some of them in unconscious bias training. But I call those marginalizing behaviors the death of 1,000 cuts. Those are the things that happen day in and day out that, as I say, progressively and successively teach people that they are not valued. So what are examples of those marginalizing behaviors? One of them is when somebody takes somebody else's idea. So I know we've all been in these situations. I've been in these situations where you're having a team meeting and you're trying to solve a problem and you offer up an idea, but it doesn't get a whole lot of discussion. And then it feels like 5 minutes later, somebody else mentions that exact same idea, and all of a sudden it is the best thing since sliced bread. But think about how that person feels. Did people hear me? You know, that sort of proverbial tap the mic. If that happens one time, no big deal. But when that happens 2 times, 3 times, what am I learning? People must not value my opinion. Let's take another marginalizing behavior. And this is one that can apply to women. So for women, we struggle to figure out how to be assertive. Let me give you an example. So let's again say we're in this big meeting and it's not going well, Rob. We're debating, we're trying to figure out a solution to something and the people are going off track. It's getting a little heated. And let's say that you, Rob, just slam your fist down and say, that's it. This is ridiculous. We're wasting our time. This is what we're going to do. And we're going to call it a day. The assessment of what you just did would be that you were exhibiting strong leadership. If I did the exact same thing, I would not be labeled a strong leader. I would probably get some sort of a derogatory label for my behaviors. Even if I do the exact same thing you do, that's not okay. Like, how can that be okay? So there's these behaviors and we have to recognize them and try to address them, when they come up and do it in the flow of work. So what do I mean by that? So again, let's just say that we're in that meeting. I'm the one who slams my fist and you hear somebody give me that label that's not okay. In the moment, in the flow of work, just sort of say, you know what? If you had done that, you would just call that being strong leadership. So that's really not okay to label it as something different. Boom. Getting the attention of somebody that I'm sure with no intention to be derogatory or to not make this feel inclusive.
The one that jumps in for me when you talk about in the flow of work from the Imperial College London, the 4D model, using a choice architecture to empower team members when they see harmful behavior, giving them tools to intervene. I think the similar example to the inflow of work one is giving them the ability to take direct action when they perhaps observe that behavior. I think anything you can use tools-wise to develop within the team and model that, use scenarios, role play it to make it a normal practice can have a really powerful benefit.
One of the things that teams have is team norms of, hey, these are the things that we agree we are going to work with each other. And a lot of times we think the value is in coming up with them. And of course you have to come up with them. But the bigger value is having the language now to remind people of our norms. And so going back to my example of those marginalizing behaviors and that example of my idea, somebody who could jump into that norm gives me quick language. I could jump in there and I could say, it sounds to me like, that's just what Christie said. So, hey team, let's listen generously, which then becomes that sort of trigger back to, oh, hey, wait a minute, potentially something just happened there that we need to focus on and try to avoid. And so when we talk about the sort of inclusion nudges, having norms is a really powerful way to be able to provide some of those nudges.
Very true. And we have lots of practical examples now that you've shared that we talked about. It's never been more important to prioritize your time and energy in your role as a leader. Gartner's leadership vision provides top-level guidance to executives and their teams on where to focus, all based on our data-driven research. Check it out at the link in the show notes to focus discussions with your team, peers, and other leaders so you can move more quickly and effectively diagnose priorities and actions, especially as you solidify your strategic plans for 2022. Something that comes up a lot now that we have those practical examples is how can we measure inclusion?
So there are 7 key areas to measure inclusion for an organization. And so it's things like we've already talked about psychological safety. We've talked about that fair treatment, and that fair treatment. Now we're talking about equity. Remember, equity isn't about equal. It's about equal access. It's integrating the differences and then integrating the differences versus tolerating the differences. And so if you have a team member of, let's say, a different religion, integrate that in, which could be something like making sure that your team meetings don't conflict with their religious holidays that might not be what the majority holidays are. It's having trust. Trust is that sort of tricky wick, is we want people to trust us first and then we can trust them. But trust actually works the exact opposite. We have to trust people first. And then even getting to more specific, like how decisions are being made and making sure that people have an equal voice and a clear understanding of what's their role in that decision making. Those are the dimensions that net. Remember, inclusion is an outcome that can net that understanding of, do you have that work environment for your employees?
I think as part of our Gartner Inclusion Index, those 7 combined really give clients the ability to start measuring inclusion, which is, as you said, can be tricky. It strikes me to be effective with inclusion. A lot of this needs to happen at an organizational level. How can individual leaders, no matter what role or function they're in, make a compelling case for inclusion and inclusive leadership?
I have no other word to say than I'm flummoxed as to why we feel like we need to make the business case for inclusive leadership. And here's why. We know that diversity is good for companies in terms of increased revenue, increased profits, more innovation. We don't need any more data to prove that diversity is important. And what we know is that diversity without inclusion is not good. And then add on our current situation where we're asking ourselves, okay, how do we keep our employees feeling motivated and engaged and wanting to stay with us? And I'm saying, create a more inclusive environment. That's the magic pill that we're trying to look for to help us to deal with our current situation.
From my own experience, and maybe even steal a line that I heard you use a lot, we have to sometimes meet people where they're at. And in our research and how close we are to a lot of the value and the benefits, the data points you shared around inclusion, it's obvious, right? Some instances, maybe not that clear to the leaders that are maybe listening, that it is this valuable. There is this much data behind it. So arming them with some of this evidence, should potentially help with that. And so look, we're maybe one or two final questions. If you can think of one simple inclusion tactic that leaders can start using today, what would it be?
So have you ever heard of the 5 whys or the 7 whys?
I have, yeah, absolutely. I've used it recently with my 3-year-old.
Excellent. Oh, I'm sure that was frustrating. You know what? That's actually a great technique for inclusion. We talk about using the 5 whys as a way to unearth with whoever it is that we're working on what might be the root cause of the problem. But it's also a great technique to unearth if there might be any issues. So if you have, for example, an employee who comes to you and says, I'm struggling with George to get this work done. Can you help me with that? Start using the why questions, and some of the whys will get to some business challenges, but there's a really good chance that some of the why might be, well, I just don't feel that he listens to me or he's showing me that he thinks my opinion has validity. Okay, now we're in the space of somebody who's telling you they're struggling to feel included. So I think that 5 and 7Y, whichever one of those you think is best, is a great technique. And when those personal issues come up, those struggles between colleagues, don't push that to the side.
Yeah, I've never really thought about using it for inclusion, but it totally will work there. So that's really cool. We have almost all of 2022 ahead of us. What would you like to see when it comes to inclusive leadership in the year ahead?
I'd really like for all of us to lean in to being an ally. And again, let me sort of frame that really quickly. When we think about our roles as leaders with our team members in the space of being supportive of them, we talk about being coaches, mentors, allies, and sponsors. And they have very different purposes. Coach is when there's something specific that somebody needs to work on. And so you help them to learn and increase their ability to perform on that. A mentor is somebody that we try to help them thinking about their career and making connections when that's the right thing to do. A sponsor is somebody who will expend their own political capital in order to help you with an opportunity. And then there's that ally. And an ally is somebody that helps us in difficult situations. And that's really what we've been talking about here, Rob, is when there's these non-inclusive behaviors, us as leaders taking that role to recognize them, which let's not skip past how much effort that is, but then also turning it around and addressing it if it's in the right moment, if maybe in the moment isn't, making sure to follow up with it afterwards. So that ally role is in the difficult situations. But when you're in the moment, watching your team members, we see when somebody starts to shut down and then saying, okay, wait a minute, Rob just shut down. Something must have happened. What's my role here? What can I do to help Rob not feel as shut down? So just really leaning into that ally role and recognizing that as leaders, we are the ones who model that behavior for our team members. So it really does need to start with us.
I think that's a really nice way to explain the ally role and make it clear. So maybe starting with a definition and ending with a definition, Christie, was a perfect way to wrap up this. Thanks so much for your time and insights on inclusion and inclusive leadership today. It was great.
Thank you so much, Rob. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to this special series around diversity, equity, and inclusion, a topic near and dear to me. Tune in 2 weeks' time for more Gartner ThinkCast. And in the meantime, please rate, review, subscribe, and share ThinkCast with a colleague so neither of you miss it.
ThinkCast is a production of Gartner. This podcast may not be reproduced or distributed in any form without Gartner's permission. It consists of the opinions of Gartner's research organization, which should not be construed as statements of fact. Content provided by other speakers is expressly the views of the speaker and/or their organization. While the information contained in this podcast has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, Gartner disclaims all warranties as to the accuracy, completeness, or adequacy of such information. Although Gartner research may address legal and financial issues, Gartner does not provide legal or investment advice, and its research should not be construed or used as such.